The death of Darius III lingered in Alexander's mind like a shadow that refused to fade. The Persian king had fallen not in battle, not as a warrior facing his enemy, but murdered in chains by the very men sworn to protect him. The desert wind had barely carried away Darius's final breath when Alexander made a vow before his army. Bessus would not escape justice. The traitor who stabbed his own king, who called himself Artaxerxes V without earning the title, would face a punishment fit for his crime. Thus began Alexander's next great pursuit, not for conquest, but for vengeance. The Macedonian army marched eastward into lands few Greeks had ever seen. The territories beyond Ecbatana were harsh, vast, and unyielding. Bessus fled toward Bactria, the far edge of the empire, hoping the mountains, deserts, and nomadic tribes would shield him. He believed that distance alone could save him. He did not yet understand that Alexander's ambition was a force that ignored distance, danger, and the boundaries of the known world. At first, the pursuit moved swiftly. Alexander's scouts returned with fresh signs of Bessus's passing abandoned packs, broken weapons, hoof marks of cavalry riding at desperate speed. Every clue fed Alexander's determination. The soldiers, though exhausted from years of campaigning, followed their king without hesitation. They knew this was not just another conquest. This was a quest to close the final chapter of an empire that had stood for centuries. At night, cold winds swept down from distant mountains, freezing the sweat on their skin. Alexander was always at the front, never lagging behind. His horse, Bucephalus, now older but still mighty, carried him across dry plains and rocky paths at relentless speed. At times, Alexander rode with only a few companions, leaving the slower infantry to catch up later. The chase became personal. Every mile brought him closer to the man who had stolen from him the satisfaction of capturing Darius alive. Rumors began to circulate ahead of Alexander's advance. Some said that Bessus had begun to lose support. The nobles who once backed his claim to the Persian throne were now turning against him. They feared Alexander's wrath. They feared the Macedonian army. And above all, they feared the shame of following a king whose legacy began with murder. As Alexander entered the region of Parthia, he learned that the satraps who once supported Bessus men like Spitamenes and Dataphans were wavering. These nobles had their own ambitions, their own alliances, and their own fears. Persia was collapsing into chaos, and each man sought to survive the storm. Alexander understood this perfectly. The empire he now ruled was held together by threads of distrust and desperation. The pursuit intensified when Alexander reached the region of Rhea. Here, Satarbazanes, another Persian noble, pretended to surrender, but soon raised a rebellion behind Alexander's back. The Macedonian king crushed the uprising with brutal speed. He refused to let Bessus use the rebellion as a distraction. Alexander's message was clear. Anyone who shielded the traitor would share his fate. As the mountains of Bactria began to rise in the distance, Alexander gathered his fastest units, the companion cavalry and the elite infantry. He delivered a simple order: "We ride ahead. Bessus will not reach his throne." The soldiers knew what this meant. This would be a chase faster and harsher than anything they had endured before. The march through the Hindu Kush tested the limits of human endurance. The mountains soared into the sky like frozen walls, their peaks coated in snow even in the scorching summer. The narrow paths were treacherous. Horses slipped and fell into deadly ravines. Cold winds tore through the soldiers' clothes, and some froze while sleeping. For 3 days, food ran out completely, but they kept moving, driven by the promise of justice and the fiery will of their king. On the other side of the mountains lay the green plains of Bactria. It was here that Alexander learned Bessus's allies had finally turned against him. Spitamenes and Dataphans, fearful of the unstoppable Macedonian advance, seized Bessus. stripped him of his royal clothing, tied him in chains just as he had done to Darius, and left him guarded by a small force near the Oxus River. Alexander approached with a cavalry detachment, breathing hard from the brutal march through the mountains. Scouts rode ahead and confirmed the news. Bessus was a prisoner of his own men. The traitor who once claimed to be king was now a king in name only. His reign had lasted mere weeks, and it had collapsed without dignity. When Alexander reached the Persian camp, he found Bessus bound, bruised, and trembling. The men who once called him their king now offered him as proof of their loyalty to Alexander. They argued that they had acted only to save Persia from chaos. But Alexander's eyes were fixed solely on Bessus. He ordered the traitor brought before him. As they dragged Bessus into the open, the Macedonian soldiers formed a silent circle. Bessus, once proud and ambitious, now looked like a broken man. His hair was matted, his clothes torn, and his body covered in dust and blood. Alexander dismounted slowly, his expression unreadable. Bessus tried to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to justify himself. But Alexander raised a hand, silencing him. He did not shout. He did not curse. His voice was calm, colder than the wind that cut across the plain. "You betrayed your king," he said, "and you stole from him the honor of facing me as a warrior." The men around shivered when they heard the quiet steel in Alexander's tone. He ordered that Bessus be taken to a nearby village, where he would face judgment according to Persian customs for treason. Alexander wanted his punishment to carry meaning not just cruelty, but symbolism. Bessus's execution was swift and brutal, a reflection of the ancient laws of Persia. His body was mutilated, then displayed as a warning to any who might attempt the same betrayal again. Alexander did not attend the execution. He did not need to. His vengeance was complete. Yet the death of Bessus did not bring him satisfaction. Instead, it deepened the transformation within him. Alexander was no longer simply the conqueror of Persia. He had become its ruler, its avenger. He had acted not only as a Macedonian king, but as a Persian one. Some of his companions noticed the change. His posture, his tone, the way he studied the lands around him, as if imagining their future under a unified empire. The pursuit of Bessus had taken him deeper into the heart of Asia than any Greek had ever gone. And now, standing in Bactria, he realized that new lands lay beyond lands filled with tribes, kingdoms, and warriors who had never heard the name Alexander. The horizon called to him, wide and limitless. His army rested for several days, recovering from the impossible journey. The soldiers exchanged stories around their fires, how they crossed deadly mountains, how they survived the desert, how they watched their king outpace them all. They felt pride, fear, and awe. Alexander had led them through the edge of the world and emerged on the other side with the traitor vanquished. But the story was not over, for while Bessus was dead, the lands of Bactria and Sogdia were far from subdued. Tribes were preparing to resist. Spitamenes, the noble who betrayed Bessus, was already stirring rebellion against Alexander. New enemies waited, hidden in mountains, deserts, and fortified towns. Alexander stood on a hill overlooking the wide plains and distant peaks. The wind carried the scent of grass and snow. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay new battles, new challenges, and new opportunities for glory. The last king of Persia was dead. Alexander was now the undisputed master of the empire. But he was not done. He turned to his generals and simply said, "We march."